Hi guys, and welcome to the third webinar in the project management series. This is the webinar called Resource Support Session 3, and this is on the subject project management. In this session, we're going to be talking you through the very final two learning activities in project management, which are project rollout and resourcing, as well as project success and lessons. So these two sets of questions, I'm going to be talking through a bit of content today that shall cover the information that you need to be able to successfully answer those two sets of questions: learning activity number 1, project rollout and resourcing, as well as the learning activity project success and lessons. So just to recap, by the end of this session today, you'll have all of the information to successfully complete those last two learning activities. Remember, this is the third out of 4 webinars in the series. This is the final resource support webinar, which means by the end of today's session, you'll also have all of the information that you need to successfully complete all of the learning activities, and therefore you're in a position where you can begin to complete any of the assessment tasks. 1, 2, and 3. Don't forget, this time next week in this session, I'm going to be running the assessment support workshop, in which I'll be actually taking you through assessment task 1, 2, and 3. If you're ready to just get going and get stuck into those assessments before next session, please remember to use the template for assessment task 1 when completing assessment task 1. So if you just open this and fill in that form that downloads, submit that as your work, and that is the requirement for the first assessment task. So if you are ready to jump onto those assessments before waiting for next week's session, just remember those templates do need to be utilized for that session. Alrighty, so let's maybe do a quick recap on last week. Last week we were talking about project risk and budgeting, and these were the questions that you had in the set from last week. So let's just recap some of the things that we talked about last week. Um, we talked a lot about risk. So the whole session was actually in and around risk. So the first question there, give examples of risks you face. We talked about different types of risks. So typically when we think about risk, we typically we think about the safety risks. So what are the risks? Or what are the risks to somebody getting injured, breaking an arm, hurting themselves on the work site, even worse than that, fatality or things like that. They're the things that we usually think about, but in project management, we need to be thinking a lot wider than that. So we talked last week about different types of risks, and remember with this, if you want to check out all of this information in greater detail, please check out the webinar resource support number 2. But we did talk about things like commercial risk or legal risks, financial risks, risks to the operation, so operational risk, a risk that would affect the day-to-day activity of the business, security risks, technological risks. We talked about a whole different set of risks like reputational risks or risks to the environment, things like that. So we did talk about a range of different things like that. Other things we talked about was risk management. So you might remember in last week's session, we talked about how to set up a risk management table, which includes the ability to describe a risk, to also rate a risk on its likelihood and impact. So the chances of it happening, its likelihood, how likely is it to actually happen, that risk? We gave the example of aliens, probably not very likely. Impact, what are the consequences of that particular risk? High, medium, low, depending on that, using a risk matrix, which is in your learning materials. You can actually sort of rate those risks and determine which ones need to be addressed first. We also talked about who's affected, the sort of control measures you can put in place on some of these things. We talked about the need to monitor and review those as well. So that was risk management. We also talked a little bit about contingency planning last week. So, I guess putting things in place to minimize the likelihood, reduce the chances of these risks actually happening. And we also talked through a SWOT analysis. I talked about the difference between internal and external analysis there on the SWOT and how that works. And yeah, then we started talking a little bit about the importance of communication, which is quite a theme for the whole course really. I mean, communication enters into the conversation at all times, and there are common themes that come through, but we talked about the need to have visibility, to be aware of things that might be unknown, to be open, and all of these things in relation to a project team to try and minimize the chances of things happening on a project that we don't want, to minimize things like risk. So that was last week's session. For a little bit more information on that, obviously jump in there. Please have a look at last week's session. Now today, I'm the only one in the session here today, guys, so a little disappointed that there's nobody's here to join me. So it's probably going to be quite a quick session, because normally I do like to have these as sort of conversational pieces, but I'll just sort of go through the material, give you a bit of a helping hand as we go. So the things I'm going to be talking about relate to this first learning activity right now, and yeah, some of the things that we're going to be covering in today's session are, the importance of communication, just following on from last week, and a couple of strategies, I guess. I'll have a bit of a chat about that. Talking about documentation, some documentation that you can use, and some tools that are available to be used in project management. We'll talk about a few of those. Resources. Resourcing a project, things to consider before resourcing a project. Measuring project success and monitoring and things like that. So let's just jump straight into today's session. Okay, so the first question that you've got there is outline a couple of communication strategies that you can implement to ensure your teams are aware of their responsibilities. So what we're talking about here is being a project manager. Now, as we've sort of been talking about projects this last couple of weeks, I want you guys to be putting yourself in the mindset of somebody who's needing to be the project manager. So you've got a team of people, you've got different stakeholders, and as we've discussed in previous sessions, different stakeholders have different needs and different expectations. The needs and expectations of people that are, your workers or construction workers might be very different from those that are what we call project sponsors, or those that are actually funding the project. Very, very different. So when we talk about communication strategies, I guess the important thing is that we have to use a variety of different methods of communicating in order to make sure that we get our message across to those that we're communicating to. Now, the typical way that a project manager might communicate with her team members, or the people on her team, or people in her stakeholders in her project, would be through the use of a project progress report. Now, project progress report is quite a simple thing. It's really, as it sounds, just about providing information to those in the project about the progress. And that would be on what are the different actions, or what are the different things that we're doing right now, and where are we up to with those particular things. So it might simply be the action, the name of the people or persons that are responsible for it, the date that that particular item or action is set to be complete, and whether it has been completed or not. It's one of the most common sort of things that you'll see, and that sort of thing usually gets emailed around. So a project manager once a week, a couple of times a week, maybe even every day. It depends on how active the particular project is, but you can never really, in my opinion, you can never over communicate. So if you're not sure on frequency, do it a little bit more just to make sure. But so that could be an everyday thing, a daily progress report saying, okay guys, here are the activities that we're currently involved in. These are the people that are responsible for the different parts of the project, and here are the dates that that is due to be completed, and if it's been completed or not. It does a couple of things. It means that all people on the team have full visibility on what other team members are doing. They might be able to shed some light or help out or do some things so they can see what's going on. It's written down, which means it's there and available for you to read when you need it. So a great example of that is that on one of the recent projects that I actually worked on, we used to have daily meetings. So we would meet every day. We would talk about what we are doing for that particular day. All of the project members were actually in the same city, so it was easy to get everybody together every morning, have a chat. But the project manager would also send through an email after that meeting saying, here are the action items, here's our progress report, here's where we're up to in the project. And I actually relied on that email a lot, because that email actually was my reference point. So if I was jumping into something, I wasn't exactly sure what I was doing, or if I needed to double check what was said in the meeting, I might go back there. Now, it's important to use, I mean, if you are the best communicator in the world, there is nobody better than you at communicating. You still need to make sure that you're covering all angles and that you are not just saying it face to face, but that you're backing it up with an email as well. Because no matter how well a communicator you think you are, everybody understands things at various different speeds, at various different levels, those sorts of things. So communication is a super, super duper important, and it's a really good idea to have a paper trail as well of your communications. And what we mean of a paper trail is evidence that you could go back to. You could open an email and say, yes, Adam, this is something that we discussed the other day, and here it's on the project report. Please check this every day to check in with your activities. So, that sort of thing is really, really important. Obviously, team meetings are a great strategy because that gets people together and you can actually discuss things. I mean, an email only is not a great form of being able to discuss. It's one way of getting messages across. So daily meetings, catch-up meetings, email updates, those progress reports are really, really important. We're going to talk about a few other tools and things that are available a little bit later, which also can be used as part of this, but really just talking about the communication strategies or methods, ways to communicate. So that's what we mean, or that's what we're looking for in this particular question. Now, interesting, something I like to sort of, in relation to a strategy, and talking about strategies aside from methods. Okay, so emails, meetings, great, but what's the strategy? I think something that we should all keep in mind as managers, as leaders, regardless of whether it's project management or not, is that we need to be able to communicate to the understanding of our listener. There's no good just communicating to our own level of satisfaction. It's important that we communicate to the level of understanding of the person that we're talking to, the listener, the receiver. So we need to check the listener's understanding. We need to make sure that they understand us the way that we are hoping that they do. Quite often when you're giving a presentation or you're explaining something to somebody, you'll do so in a way that is the way that you understand it. Or it might be the way that you learned something. You'll explain that to somebody else. Now, everybody has different ways of learning and adapting and so forth. We need to be able to be really clever communicators as leaders. So we need to make sure that we're communicating to the understanding of the listener. So there's a few ways of doing that. The most obvious way is to actually ask questions. Like, so if I'm explaining something to somebody, hey, does that make sense? Do you understand what I'm saying? Yes, no, okay, great. That's a really simple way. Another way is getting the listener to repeat what you just said or paraphrase. So, yep, do you want to just repeat back to me what you understand your activity to be? Okay, great. And that's one of the best ways to do it because you're hearing it from their mouth, saying exactly what it is you need them to understand. So that's a really good way of doing it. But the other way is, I guess, considering the background of the person that you're speaking to. Sometimes we forget how much we know about anything, about everything. If you've been in a workplace for a very, very, very long time, you might forget how many things you had to learn when when you first started in that job. So try and remove assumptions and try and remove a lot of that sort of stuff but it's not always easy to. We sometimes forget what it is we know. So I guess falling back to asking questions. So when we're checking understanding, ask questions, get them to repeat. Interestingly enough, use somebody's name as a really good communication strategy. So we are very receptive to the sound of our own name. If I'm trying to communicate to a particular person and there's a big group of people around, if I use their name, their ears will prick up, they'll hear what's going on. It's the cocktail party effect, where if I'm standing on one side of the cocktail party and somebody mentions my name on the other side, I can hear that over a whole party of conversations. I can hear my name spoken. It's that effect. We're really tuned in from a very, very early age as kids or babies to the sound of our own name. So use somebody's name because it actually helps to gain somebody's attention. Now, another communication strategy that I like is that it's really clever to try and gain somebody's attention before you speak. So what do I mean by that? Leave a gap and then speak. So if instead of yelling instructions at somebody, I might say, hey, John, leave a gap. This is what I'd like you to do. By leaving a gap, and when I say a gap, 1 second is enough, half a second's probably more than enough. The gap gives that person the chance to catch up to you. Quite often we just say, hey, John, I need you over here, blah, 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 blah. And the person that we're speaking to is, their mind is thinking about something else, and now they're having to close down that thought process and then enter your conversation and be completely with you. It's actually not intentionally, but it is almost rude to presume that somebody will drop whatever it is that they are thinking about and completely focus on what you have to say. So one way to alleviate that is say, hey John, leave a gap. Okay, then continue what it is you want to say. You give them an opportunity. You're saying their name, which they're going to recognize, but you're giving them an opportunity to focus in on what you're about to say. So a couple of good things there. Do you guys remember that thing that went around Facebook or the internet went viral recently? There was that uh, two dresses and they were different colors, but some people saw the dress was blue and black, some saw it as gold and white. And perception is a very, very interesting thing. And this is, I guess, where it comes down to communication. So, and this comes back to being able to communicate with the understanding of the listener. People understand and people perceive things in very different ways. There's a lot of things that go on that make up, um, that make up the way that we understand things. So, um, as good communicators and as project leaders, especially as project management leaders, there's a lot of money on the line. There's lots of people involved. We have no choice but to make sure that the people that we're communicating to completely understand what we're talking about. Okay, now the next one we're going to talk about record keeping systems and also some um, documentation for tools and things like that for projects. So I guess one of the purposes for keeping, one of the questions here is what project record keeping systems are you required to maintain for your organisation? Well, there's a good page for that. There's a page on your learning materials called Auditing and Record Keeping Systems. Go straight to that page and get a few ideas for this particular answer there. I guess when we're auditing a project, we need to keep records on our projects for the purpose of audit, but an audit will actually uncover if the project you've identified and monitored all the costs and the benefits of the project. It'll actually identify if your project has been in line and successful with the plan and on time within budget. I guess the purpose of auditing a project will uncover things like conflicts, interpersonal conflicts, missed deadlines due to lack of communication, things like that. So it's really important to keep records of everything to, just to be able to minimize those sorts of things happening. So have a look at that page. The thing that I do mostly want to talk about is the use of project tools and project management. If you have a look back at let's go back to the subject page, the learning materials. Click on the learning materials here. There's some information on project tools, project management tools in here. Let's have a look at those. Some of the project management tools that the system or the learning materials talk about here: the critical path schedule, PERT chart, cost schedule control system, life cycle cost analysis, and so forth. The information for those is right there for you, so you can sort of see them. In fact, I think if you click on these, they actually link and they'll open up to another page. I think it's a Wikipedia page there, gives you a bit of an explanation on it. So let's click on those so that we can actually view these at the same time. There's a good image somewhere around here. Yeah, I don't know if you guys can see this image in the right-hand side. You can always click on it if you need to. But the critical path scheduler is actually a visual representation of the tasks that need to be done. Another one, a really common one, is a Gantt chart too, which I'll show you in a second as well. The critical path is actually almost one step up on the Gantt chart, because what it actually does is says, okay, we've got all these things that we need to do in our project. We need to do this, we need to do that, blah, blah, blah. What it does actually differentiate between is those things that are reliant on other things. So The ones in the middle here are relying on the other ones to be completed before that stage happens. So A might be order paint, B might be paint. You can't paint before having ordered the paint and receiving the paint. So therefore, there's a certain order that some things need to happen in. Other tasks are not reliant on that order, and therefore they don't need to be in what we call the critical path. So often there are, or there will, and this is straight out of the learning materials, there will be tasks that are not in the critical path, and those can be done at any given time. So a critical path requires a list of all the activities required to complete the project, a time that's required for each of those activities to be completed, and the dependencies between each of the activities. And that is the key with the critical path. I want to show you the Gantt chart because the Gantt chart's a nice little visual representation of activities as well. So all of these tools are there to make life easier as project managers and when we're communicating. And so the first question when I talked about communication strategies, I don't mind if you want to refer to the use of some of these tools because they do help, absolutely. So what you can see here with the Gantt chart is different activities. So activity number 1, A, activity B, C, D, whatever it actually might be. The red is this is in this case, this is the estimated time, and the blue might actually be the actual time that particular task takes to complete, so on and so forth. So you can actually get a visual representation of when things are happening and when things are not. I guess the difference between the Gantt chart and a critical path analysis is that the critical path schedule actually shows the dependencies between different tasks. So the Gantt chart usually just lists the timelines of when things are actually happening. Things can happen at different times. I guess the issue with that is if something's running late, something's running behind, sometimes that does actually push other items back as well. So the critical path shows the items that have dependencies with other items, and it means that if one thing is running late, it doesn't actually delay the whole project because other items that aren't dependent on those things can be dealt with. So all of these sort of tools are there to make life easier, are there to help with communication, are there to minimize risk. So please have a look at some of those tools that are in the learning materials for you. Let's go back to some of these questions. Okay, so next question, or question 3, talks about all projects require resourcing, and what are some of the considerations? Well, firstly, let's talk about the word resources. I guess there's 2 main types of resources, people and things. So we've got our human resources and then we've got our physical resources. So the question is saying all projects require people and things. What are the considerations that need to take place within your role as the manager? So again, you're putting yourself in that space as project manager when determining the correct levels. So when we're trying to work out how many staff we need, how many of these particular items we need to order, all of these sort of things. So what are the things that we need to think about beforehand? Some of the obvious ones would be cost. How much is it going to cost to have this many staff? Time frames, that'll be a really big thing. So before we order things, we have to work out when do we actually need them. What about where are we going to place them? If we're ordering 1,000 paint tins to complete the paint job, when are we going to order them? How much is it going to cost? Where are we going to put them? We might have to also determine who we're actually going to order these items from. So who our supplier might be. How do we get in touch with them? How do we order from them? We might need to consider if we're talking about human resources, who we might engage with, recruiting staff or consultants, things like that. So that's simply what the question's asking. There's nothing too complicated about that one. I guess the question's sort of a bit strange, but yep. Now, the question 4, identify any project that you've been involved in, talk about the key safety risks. We did a little bit on risks last week, so go back to that. Something that will come up, actually, I've got it here on my sheet to mention today, something that will actually come up in your assessment task, number 2, is what we call financial lines of authority and decision making. So, in essence, when you're doing your assignments in this subject. Your first assignment is to create a project. You can make it up. You're the project manager. The second one is to talk about how you're going to be reporting on things that are happening in your project. So it follows on from the first one. And one of the questions you need to answer in this one is, what are your financial lines of authority and decision making? Basically, if somebody on your project team needs to spend money or buy something for the project, who is authorized to do this? So are there multiple people that are involved to sign off on a purchase? So is there a financial officer? Does it have to go through you as well? Is there somebody that monitors budgets? If we have different teams, if we have different groups of stakeholders and different teams, are there different rules for different teams? Do some departments have a slush fund or their own budget that they can monitor themselves, or does everything have to go through you? Um, are people allowed to spend a certain amount, and over a certain amount it must be authorized? So what happens if your team are, we've been talking about painting a lot today, so okay, so you've got a lot of painters and they break one of their paintbrushes and they need to go out and buy a new paintbrush. Do they have, what happens in that case? Is it different to if, there's a big expense that comes up on the project, those little expenses? So is there a little slush fund available that, your staff can go back and get on with business? So is there petty cash? Is there a minimum, maximum? Talk about that sort of thing. What happens if somebody needs something right this second? Is there an escalation? That's what we're talking about. Now, the last question, it's a YouTube clip. It talks about what did you learn from the YouTube in relation to transitioning a project team, and what are some of the areas to focus on. So this whole set is actually called Project Rollout and Resourcing. And usually the word rollout is really sort of like your implementation. So project rollout, now in the very first session I was talking through an example of a project I was on where I worked at a busy call center, and there was about 150 telephone operators in that center, and I was subject matter expert or assisting on the project team to help the business to update all of their phone systems. So everybody got a brand new telephone at their desk, but they also got a piece of software on their computer that they had to learn this new software, how to use what we call the soft phone. So rollout, in that case, in that project, rollout was the day that all of the phones were set up. So before rollout, we had our scoping, we had our planning stage. We moved into testing. Actually, there was a lot of testing that went on. In fact, in the world of software, there's a process called UAT, which is user acceptance testing. It's basically testing a particular software for the user, the end user's use in it. So how does this actually work when I'm using it in the real world? It's called user acceptance testing. And so there's a lot of testing, and then after the testing, once everything was happy and done, the rollout is actually the day that those phones were actually put out. So this YouTube clip talks about a little bit about what to focus on when you're actually managing changes or managing transitioning your team through that change. And I think the key thing is that usually with project rollout is it's go time. It's now's the time. Now we're actually doing the thing that we've been talking about. It's all about helping people to manage change. So it's a bit of a shame that we don't have anyone in the room, because I'd love to have this as a group discussion, or to talk about, I guess, change and how to help people manage change, and I guess why people, human beings as a general rule, I guess we struggle with change a little bit. So I wonder why that is. But what can we do as project managers to assist people through this process? I guess something that I'd like to talk about in relation to managing change is, the thing that I notice is that uncertainty is a really big deal. So when managing change with people, uncertainty is something that we need to essentially manage for our people. It is actually the uncertainty that sets off what we call our fight and flight response. And our fight and flight response is when you get that rush of adrenaline, something happens, and it's like when you're about to have a car accident, that quarter of a second that happens before impact, you get that sort of adrenaline rush. Or imagine a tiger jumps out, you're walking down the street and a tiger jumps out. Ooh, you're going to get that fight. You're going to either run or you're going to fight. That's effectively what's going to happen in this particular situation. Your body gets a huge surge of adrenaline, and off you go. The reality is there's a degree of uncertainty that actually is related to setting off our fight and flight response. It's not necessarily the lion or the tiger that's actually scaring us. It's more the uncertainty about what's about to happen. So, for example, if you went to a theme park and there was trained lions and tigers there, and there was the zookeeper was there with the tiger and said, "Come over here and pat the tiger," and you'd feel completely comfortable walking over and patting that tiger. The same tiger jumped out while you were walking down the street on you know, of an evening, that would actually trigger your fight and flight response because there's the uncertainty of the situation, which is actually what it is. So in saying that, now that fight and flight response, adrenaline release, what happens is your heart rate goes up to 1,000,000 miles an hour. You start breathing really heavily. You might get sweats. A lot of these sort of things happen, and it is connected to uncertainty. So what happens is when there's a great amount of change happening for people, it quite often is the uncertainty that sets off a lot of these physical responses, which create a loop, which is hard for people to break. What we want to try and do is take out the anxiety out of these big changes. So we want to remove any uncertainty whatsoever when we're managing change or trying to transition people, especially as we're rolling into what we call that project rollout phase. Super, super, super important. Also, what you can do in a project rollout is try and make things fun. So try and make something fun. So when we had I think I mentioned in the first session, when we had our rollout, we had a whole day of activities set up for the day. We had games, we had activities, everybody was in casual dress. We had all of the managers dressed up in superhero outfits. Everybody got a chocolate phone put on their desk. It was like a giant lolly in the shape of a phone. A little show bag. Everybody had a show bag. Uh, that's half of the part. That's half of it. Don't forget the other half, which is managing that uncertainty. But it's all these things that you try and do to minimize the anxiety of the day and of that transition. So that's all about managing change. Cool. I guess that ends that first set. Let's have a look at the next one, project success and lessons. So the first question is, list an example of typical KPIs or metrics that you would use to measure project success. Okay, so what we're looking here is ways that you're actually going to measure the particular success of a project. So a KPI, if you haven't come across that, is a key performance indicator. And a key performance indicator usually has some sort of number associated with it. So, we need you to answer 95% of all of the incoming calls that are directed to your phone. We need you to sell $200 worth of hamburgers today. There's usually a number set aside to it, because a KPI, if it doesn't have a number, it's almost not measurable. So if the KPI was, we want all of your customers to be happy, it's really hard to measure. How would you know when they're happy? And we talk about this a little bit in SMART goals, and the measuring part really needs a number associated to it. It's really hard to measure something without a number. It can be done, but keep that in mind. So in sport, a KPI might be a batting average for a cricketer or a baseball player. If you're a football player, it might be how many average disposals. You might have to, your KPI and football team might be, we need you to get 20 kicks every game. So that might be your KPI. On the stock exchange, it might be, a KPI might be dividends or rates of returns. In manufacturing, it might be things like, the cycle time, how long it takes an item to come into the manufacturing plant and then come out at the other end. We call that an input. How long does it take an input to make it through the entire process chain? In project management, probably the completion date is one of the most common measurements. So if a project is running late, it's usually a problem. We talked about a project in the first session about setting up Christmas decorations in the city. Now imagine those Christmas decorations were late and didn't come until January. You'd probably say, well, there's probably little point in this whatsoever. So the time is actually quite important. Another way that some projects measure their success are on things like measuring defects or outstanding issues. In actual fact, it was a measurement on the telephony project that I worked on was that after the rollout stage, there was the what we call our monitoring stage. So what I was in charge of was monitoring defects. So somebody would say, hey, this button doesn't work, or I tried to transfer a call to somebody and we had a problem. You would actually write down that defect on a spreadsheet, on a log. I was communicating with that time the actual software developers to help me and help resolve issues and what have you. The project itself was one of the forms of measurements was, well, how many issues did we have after we rolled out? Because really, we want to make sure that if we're successful, is that we have a minimal impact when we roll this project out. We want as little people to complain, to have issues, and this is one of the ways that we're going to measure the success of the project. Other ways might be, quality. How quality of the actual product. You might be developing a brand new product. What's the quality of that at the end of the day? Were your outcomes achieved? Some projects measure their success on the back of feedback from stakeholders. So what did people say about it? Did they like it? Were they happy? Those sorts of things. So that's question one. Just talk about a couple of ways that you could actually measure. Give me a couple of examples of KPIs that you would use to actually measure the success of a project. The next question talks about a list of deliverables on a given project and were they achieved. A deliverable usually has a due date and it's a tangible thing. It's something that you can usually touch and feel. Deliverables, again, they work closely with KPIs. They usually link to the project outcomes. So a deliverable should also be very, very clear. Like a goal, it's got to be clear and specific. The more ambiguous the deliverable, the less likely it'll be achieved. So your activities should be directly linked to your goals, your deliverables. I guess the difference between, so your deliverables might be we talked about last week, I think we talked about the Parliament House project, refurbishing or repainting Parliament House. The deliverable will be to repaint Parliament House. That is the deliverable. By the end of this project, there'll be 10 rooms that'll be painted and they'll be painted in bright yellow. That's the project. That's the deliverable. We also talk on projects, so we want you to actually list a few of these deliverables. What are some of the actual deliverables on a given project? There are other things that we talk about, and I will differentiate between them. That we have other things called benefits on a project. A benefit is actually something that's not tangible; it's intangible. Sometimes more important than the actual tangible one. So, in the case of repainting, a new coat of paint is actually the goal. That is the actual deliverable in itself. However, increased enjoyment or pleasure or satisfaction level from you or your friends because of the new paint job. In the case of Parliament House, satisfaction from politicians that are using it. Are they more productive? Maybe an increase in productivity might happen as a result of their satisfaction with the new paint job. Maybe they can actually conduct work in a more effective and efficient way. There might be a series of things that happen as a result that weren't the original intentions, or maybe they were part of the original intentions. Our deliverables are the tangible things, though. So when we talk about deliverables, we want you to list the actual tangible things that we're trying to deliver on the project. What are our goals on this project? Some of the outcomes or benefits are the intangible things like satisfaction levels and so forth. So come up with a list of different deliverables. Cool. Describe 3 ways you could evaluate the success of a project. That's effectively just the same as question 1. So examples of KPIs that you'd use to measure a project, no worries. So I guess with the first question, give me some numbers, but with the third one, give me just some areas. So whether it's feedback from stakeholders, whether it's time on budget, things like that. With the first one, you can actually give me some actual examples. So, by 95% satisfaction level from A, B, and C stakeholder. That's a beautiful KPI. No worries. Okay. Now we've talked question 4. We actually talked about this a little bit in other sessions. Why it's important to involve team members in the review of a project. So this is actually talking about at the end. We talked about the need to involve team members at the start of a project. We've talked about the need to involve team members at all stages of a project, but we also talk about the need to involve them in the review. And I guess the real importance of involving somebody in the review of a project is to gather information that you can use to make things happen a bit better for next time. So by reviewing a project, we can actually talk about, firstly, the things that we did really well, and also the things that we could do a little bit better. It's actually really important to, celebrate the successes with your team, and we talk about that as a leadership thing, but it's important to celebrate the success with your team because that'll re-energize your team to continue working hard and continue to have an involvement. So it's just as important to celebrate the successes and identify areas that you did really well. I mean, there might be things on the project as project management. I mean, as project manager, we try and be aware of everything, but there's clearly some things that we may not be able to see. There's a lot of people on our project, lots of things are happening. Our team might be able to provide us some things that we did really well and we actually don't even know about it. And it's something that we can remember for next time and then communicate to our next team whenever we have another project again. We have that information. We should be right to, do a little bit better next time. So I guess it's really important to involve people in your team to be able to celebrate those successes, but to learn some lessons for next time. It also helps just to minimize things like people wanting to sabotage your project because they feel upset that you weren't part of, that you weren't celebrated or thanked for your involvement or things like that. So it's just good to get everybody together, learn from what you did well, learn from what you could do better next time, and that's the main thing. Some other things I want to talk about just before we wrap up today's session is a little bit about legislation. Your final project in this, and again, I'll be going through all of this in a bit better detail next week in the assessment support workshop, but your final assessment is to actually talk about 5 different areas of legislation and how it might impact on your particular project. So a couple of just broad areas I just want to briefly talk about, and it's something that you guys need to research anyway, so I'm not going to talk about it too much. But one of the 5 areas that I want you to be able to comment on, and when I say comment, it's to write 100 words on each of these 5 areas, so it's not a whole lot. But we want you to talk about anti-discrimination laws. We want you to talk about things like codes of practice, environmental legislation, workplace health and safety, and privacy law. So they're the 5 areas. I'll just briefly talk about each area before we wrap up today's session now. So when you're looking at anti-discrimination law, it's a broad category. So anti-discrimination law actually includes things like the Age Discrimination Act or the Disability Discrimination Act, racial discrimination, sexual discrimination. There are a series of acts or legislations which are the law. If it's a piece of legislation, it is the law in Australia. There are a series of laws, legislations that come under that anti-discrimination banner. So that anti-discrimination law is a category, and we have things like the Sex Discrimination Act of 1984, Racial Discrimination Act 1975. Australia actually has obligations under a number of international human rights treaties to take measures to eliminate discrimination on these bases. So this is where it comes down to. There's a website called comlaw.gov.au. There's a link in the supplementary materials list, guys. That gives you a bit of an overview on some of these anti-discrimination pieces of legislation, things like that. So you can review that. Comlaw.gov.au is a good one to go to. There's information also on the rights.gov.au website. Human Rights Commission was actually a commission established in '86 to resolve complaints of discrimination or breaches of human rights under federal laws. I think they're an independent body that's been put together. That's what we're essentially wanting you to be aware of, is just generally speaking the overview of these areas, and the importance of understanding that is that when we're project managers or when we're planning for projects, these things are really big considerations. So we need to be aware of them when we're project managing. The next category that you're going to be talking about is one called compliance codes. And again, I'll go through this again with you next week. But compliance codes essentially provide a practical guide to those who have duties or obligations under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. So whilst compliance codes aren't necessarily the law per se, what they are is a guide to stay within the laws. So there are guides like on how to safely remove asbestos, for example. So occupational health and safety suggests that we're not allowed to put our staff members under any unnecessary sort of risk to their health, to their safety, those sorts of things. So there's what happens if we have to remove asbestos. It's quite a dangerous thing. There's a guide under what we call a compliance code. There's a code of practice on how to safely remove asbestos from a workplace. And if you stick to these codes of practices, you will be therefore in line and in code with your with the legal ramifications or with legislation. That's the idea. They're practical guides to remain compliant within the Occupational Health and Safety Act. The other areas that we want you to talk about is environmental. Have a look at the Environmental Protection Act in 1970, I think it was. It's there to deal with a whole range of environmental issues. I guess there's a few other ones in there too. Pollution of Waters and Oils Act of 1986. There's a National Environment Protection Council Act of 1995. Have a look at those ones. And there's actually one, I think, a Climate Change Act from the last couple of years as well. So again, we want you to just talk about how some of those pieces of legislation might impact on your project. It might be the way that you're disposing of your waste. It might be the way that you're treating our environment as a part of your project. There are pieces of legislation that govern that, so keep an eye out for that. Workplace health and safety. Workplace health and safety is a bit of a changing thing. All of the different states once upon a time had their own workplace health and safety legislation. What's actually happening now is all of the states and territories are now starting to become harmonized, i.e. that everybody now has one sort of guide or health and safety set of regulations between in Australia. So Safe Work are actually the ones that are actually going to be governing that. So have a look at Safe Work when looking at workplace health and safety. But yeah, there's a guide also that you can check out called the Guide to Workplace Health and Safety Act. There's a PDF file which talks about that. And really the aim of workplace health and safety or occupational health and safety is to provide workers in Australia with, the same standard of health and safety regardless of where you work. I guess that's the purpose of harmonizing it between states, but the purpose of these laws is to make workplaces as health and safe a place as they can be. I guess the reasons also for harmonizing these laws, these state laws, is to get a bit more certainty between business. I mean, the world is a changing place. We're a global economy now, but at least within Australia, we should have some sort of continuity between this one country. Things like that. Privacy law is the last thing that you'll be talking about there in those categories. There's a Privacy Act of 1988, and it is an Australian law. It regulates the handling of personal information about individuals. It includes the collection, how you use that information, how you store that information, and how you talk about or disclose that information to other people. And so you also need to comment on your project about the privacy law and how that might actually affect you and your. Again, I'll talk about this a little bit next week, just sort of give you a bit of an overview now. That, I guess, ends today's session on project success and lessons and project rollout and resourcing, thus ending the last resource support session for project management. Thanks very much for checking out this webinar. Look forward to seeing you next week. All the best.